The roll call.
Dana Hollinger,
Here.
Bill Slayton.
Here.
Margaret Brown.
Good morning.
Steve Juarez for John Chung.
Here.
Richard Costigan. Priya Mathur.
Here.
Alan LaFaso for Betty Yee.
Here.
Great. And the second order of business is the approval of the June 20th, 2018 Risk and Audit Committee timed agenda. Do I have a motion? Okay. Moved by Slayton, seconded by Mather. All those in favor? Any opposed? No? Okay. So on to the next. Miss Timberlake Diadamo, can you please, on the number 3, the executive report?
Sure. Good morning, Risk and Committee members. I'm happy to say good morning because we're usually in the afternoon, so I have to make sure I get that in. Do we want to reflect the fact that there are additional members that are joining? Because we usually do that.
Oh, yes. We want to reflect additional members.
Yeah, I would like to reflect that Miller and Rubikava are present.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today, we have 5 action items and 1 information item. We have a rather full Risk and Audit Committee agenda planned for today, given that it is our year-end process, and we will be presenting to you our annual plans for several branches within CalPERS. Today, Enterprise Compliance will present their 2018-2019 annual plan, focusing on program maturity and key focus areas for the upcoming fiscal year. In addition, Enterprise Compliance will propose amendments to the personal trading regulation, which will require committee approval. A third approval item, or action item, I should say, is the Enterprise Risk Management Division will present their 2018-2019 annual plan, highlighting activities such as the risk assessment and risk measures, thresholds and reporting tools, the ERMD data management project, and other items. In addition to risk and compliance annual plans, we also have 2 annual plans from the audit team. We have our OFAS presenting their annual plan for 2018-2019, and our independent auditor, KPMG, will be here presenting their plan for 2018-19. Or, I'm sorry, their plan for the 2017-18 fiscal year. The next Risk and Audit Committee meeting is scheduled for September 25th, 2018, and includes external audit fees and the 2017-2018 annual compliance report. Thank you, Madam Chair. This concludes my report, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Seeing no questions, we'll move on to item 4, action consent items. Can I have a motion for the approval of the February 12th, 2018 minutes? Okay, first I would like to note that Richard Costigan is here, and it was moved by Costigan and seconded by Mather. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, item moves forward. Nothing on item 5. These are consent items, and I've gotten no request to remove anything from the agenda, so let's move on to item 6. And Ms. Timberlake Diadamo on the 2018-2019 Enterprise Compliance Plan.
Great, thank you. With me, seated to my left, is Cami Niebank, the Deputy Chief Compliance Officer for Enterprise Compliance. And today we are... Do we have it? Oh, sorry. The annual plan for enterprise compliance. And I just wanted to take sort of a minute to do a little bit of background, since we do have 2 new board members on the committee, and to talk a little bit about what we do at this time of year and what our annual plan looks like versus what it had looked like in previous years. So this year in June, we do our annual presentation of our plan. This is the 4th year of our 5-year plan. So in 2015, we implemented a 5-year plan, and we're now entering our 4th year of that plan. The previous years, we had done a review based on the compliance elements, and those of you who've been on the committee for a while remember the 7 compliance elements, which are factors to consideration when doing a compliance program, measuring actually the effectiveness of a compliance program, and those stem from the Department of Justice guidelines. And so this year, given our 2017-2022 strategic goals, 3 of which focus on enterprise risk and compliance, are maturing the program, measuring the maturity of the program, as well as doing some measurements on benchmark surveys with both internal CalPERS employees and team members, as well as external. And so we have those 3 objectives that we have been given to work on. And so in looking at those 3 objectives and in figuring out how to make those measurements, we actually moved our, I'll say, the presentation really of our annual plan to something that moves a little bit away from the compliance elements. And if you all remember, it focused on things like governance and risk assessments and behaviors and things like that, to the CEB plan. So CEB is an organization, it's part of Gartner, which we're familiar with, and they basically do a lot of work around measuring, consulting, research and information around the compliance and risk programs. And so what we have found is that CEB has a very robust program, I'll say, or tool really, that is used to measure your compliance effectiveness. And so we've decided to use the CEB tool to help us measure our maturity for our compliance program. And so on page 5 of the presentation, we've sort of have included the way that we look at operating processes and supporting processes now, which is really based on the way that we've moved towards our enterprise performance reporting. And so we're really trying to align the work that we're doing so that it looks very similar to the way that we're presenting other initiatives in other areas of the organization. Slide 6 then looks at sort of how and this might be a little bit familiar to those of you who've been on the committee for a while, because this looks at the work that we do in relation to either an operating process or a supporting process. And so what we're looking at is how we're going to be measuring what we're going to be doing and how we're going to measure those initiatives for the coming year. And so on slide 7 is sort of the result of the maturity assessment that we've done with CEB. And so I had wanted to take a moment here to talk a little bit about the benchmark at CEB, because it is not sort of a public agency benchmark. It's actually a private company benchmark. And I did have a couple of statistics that I wanted to give in terms of this. The size of the benchmark was 115 organizations, and it really is made up of private companies that represent several, I just have my notes here, several billion in revenue, as well as 23% of the benchmark represents more than 40,000 employees. 39% represents between 10,000 and 40,000 employees. And 24% of this benchmark represents about 5,000 or less employees. So CalPERS, being part of this benchmark, really is one of the smaller organizations in this benchmark. And so what we like the benchmark, even though it's not a perfect fit because we are the only public agency in the benchmark, it is made up of some very highly regulated entities. And so, as you all know, with highly regulated entities, you come with a lot of requirements and rules and things like that that have to be maintained. So we feel comfortable measuring ourselves in this space because this is where we strive to be, even though we would say that we are the only public agency in this. It looks like Ms. Hollinger has a question.
No, Mr. Slayton. Wait. I don't know. It's not working.
We're going to figure it out.
One. Pam?
Let me just take it out. Let me put it back.
Okay.
No, it's grayed out. That's,
Yeah, it's not. One sec.
it's grayed out.
It's because her microphone's on speaker.
Oh.
Oh, okay, restart. So let me ask, because of the nature of the companies that are in here, and as you mentioned, highly regulated institutions are in there, I assume major banks and investment companies.
16% are financial services, 13% are high-tech and telecom, 13% are manufacturing, and 12% are healthcare and pharma.
Great. So we're at a 2+ right now. Where, should we be a 5, or really should we not be a 5? In other words, where should we be? Where do you want us to be?
So,
Think we should appropriately be.
so I think a 5 is, being in compliance. I would say we're always striving for continuous improvement. A 5 is, I think it's a very high bar, and I don't know that, there are many 5s. You might find some of the highly regulated industries that are, striving towards 5, but I really think that 5 is sort of a very high bar to reach. I think in terms of where we are at a 2+, with the benchmark itself being a 3, that's a very good spot for us to be, given the fact that, I spent some time talking about the maturity itself and sort of how we viewed our assessment using the compliance elements and choosing initiatives within those compliance elements that bring us along. The switch, really, in moving to this maturity assessment is that it is much more formal and it is much more rigid in terms of, as we get into the presentation, you'll see there's sort of a step ladder that it uses in order to really measure your maturity. And so as you complete items within that step ladder, you are getting more and more credit for being more and more mature. And in some instances, we may do things that are sort of at the higher end and maybe do some things or not other things at the lower end. And so you don't get full credit for a maturity if you haven't completed all of the steps within the step ladder there. So I think for us, a 2+ is a great starting point. I think honestly for us, we really look at this maturity assessment to measure sort of where we are versus ourselves. And so what we're really looking for in choosing the items that we're going to do as initiatives in the upcoming year is to make sure that we're moving the bar for ourselves versus sort of where we are versus 115 other private sector companies that, might not look a whole lot like us. I will add, Mr. Slayton, that as it relates to our peers, we really believe that we are very far ahead in a lot of respects. We have a personal trading program. We do a lot of things that other public plans and public agencies don't do. And so we are routinely asked to come in and provide guidance and support and talk to others about the work that we do. And so in choosing the maturity assessment, we didn't really feel it would be right to sort of look at ourselves versus public pension plans, because we know that in the circles that we work with and we speak to a lot of those public pension plans, we're already ahead of what they do. So we really want to give ourselves a bar to reach, as opposed to just saying that we're already ahead, so we don't really measure it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I compliment you and your staff for being willing to put us in this bucket with this group, because it's a way for us to figure out what are the other things that we can be doing that tighten the ship. So
yes, and the reason why we chose this assessment is because it really helps to do that. And it is sort of I'll sort of use the word that you said about our willingness to put us in the bucket, because it is sort of a very frank, sort of robust and rigid sort of view. And so, but we feel that it's the right thing to do, and we think that it will really give the committee great information about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and where we think we're going to be going.
good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Continue.
Okay. So here, this is exactly what I was speaking to just a moment ago about the maturity path sample. And so this is really here to give the committee an idea of sort of how the measurement occurs. And so the gray boxes are the things that we do. The blue box is sort of what CEB has identified, the thing that you need to do next in order to reach the next level or to get through to the next level. And then the gray box at level 4 is sort of something that we do, but we're not essentially getting full credit for it because we have, a couple of things in item 3 to do as well. So this is sort of the withdrew of how the measurement is done. And so what you'll see is there are about 28 of these that we went through and answered robust questions on, and the assessment was then given. So it's a very detailed, very rigid sort of review, which we're providing so that we can really measure sort of on a very specific basis what are the things that we need to do in order to move the program to the next level. And so on page 9, we have our 2018-19 focus areas. And so those of you who have been on the committee will see that this looks a little bit familiar in that we then sort of list out the different objectives and goals that we're going to be doing in the upcoming year. And so in this instance, the white boxes are the items that we've identified as initiatives for us in the upcoming year. And so we've listed these, whereas in previous versions, we've listed it as a part of the compliance elements. Here we've listed it as our new framework in terms of the operating processes and the supporting processes. And then in from slides 10 through 13, we then take you through sort of a description of each of the initiatives that we're going to be undertaking and where they fit in terms of those operating processes and sub-processes. And so for our ethics program, we have manage third-party risks, maintain reporting channels, and establish incentives and disciplinary measures. So these are initiatives that we're going to be working on in 2018-19 that's going to help us move the program maturity forward. In the policies and delegations area, on the next slide, we have identified a code of conduct as something that we're going to be working on, and specifically within that, we have include easy to understand guidance on, we say high risk, and it really probably should mean highly sensitive policies. So here we want to make sure, because training is something that we are really, really interested in making sure that we're doing, and we're doing well. We are looking to improve and add to the training on different policies and things that we're doing as an organization. And then the other item here, we says incorporate learning aids to increase comprehension. One of the things, and I think maybe Ms. Mahler and I talked about it at the last Risk and Audit Committee meeting, is, training is great, but we really feel like in a lot of respects you need to do it more frequently and you need to do it sometimes more targeted. And so some of the things that we're looking at are how do we reach people right before they have something to do and make sure that they're trained on those things so that there's an improved or an increased likelihood that we'll get it right. And so an example of that is right before the holiday season, we send out memorandums and information around gifts, because we know that gift giving occurs around the holiday season. We want to make sure that people are aware of what the rules are and what they need to do in terms of gifts. In the Compliance Monitoring and Oversight Division, we have a couple of items that we've listed here. We have assess compliance risks, and here we're going to partner with our Risk Management Office to establish a compliance risk assessment process. And we're also going to assess the compliance risks at the operational and enterprise level. And then in addition to that, we're going to build mitigation plans for key compliance risks. And here we're going to look to use the compliance risk assessment to identify those key risks and to document risk-specific mitigation programs. And so again, looking at these items, what we would say is that each of these items helps to move us further along in our maturity assessment. And on page 13, for education, communications, and reporting, we have measure organizational culture, promote a culture of integrity. Here we're going to reinforce the importance of ethics and compliance communications. And communications is something that we spend quite a bit of time on, not only because of what I had mentioned about the training, but just because we think it's really important to reach out to people and to make sure that we're visible and we're available. And then the last item we have is measure and report the program effectiveness. And so here we've highlighted benchmark our program maturity against peers, as well as provide context for metrics by analyzing trends over time. So that actually concludes our presentation on the annual plan, and at this point, I or Cammie would be happy to take any questions.
I want to thank you for the thoroughness and the depth of this report, and thank you and staff. It's very impressive. I feel like you've left no holes, and it really is a source of comfort and also speaks to the level of risk management that we're undertaking. And I do have some questions. Mr. Slayton?
So this is very thorough, but it raises one issue in my mind, and if you talked about it when we were on page 11, which was code of conduct, and you mentioned an example of making sure when issues are going to come up, you get ahead of it. And you use the example of gift giving before the holidays. So that raised an issue for me is what about constant training, constant exposure to this, and helps reduce risk. What about training up to us, training up to the board? I know we have policies, very well written. We have lots and lots of policies, but reminding us when again, we need to be constantly trained and retrained so that we're sensitive to what we need to avoid doing our jobs.
We would be happy to work with the board and the Risk and Audit Committee members to provide those additional training or additional information.
Yeah, I think it's just good reminders because the policy sits in a binder versus getting a reminder of issues that could trip us up that we want to certainly avoid. So I would just ask the chair to consider working with you and seeing if we can come up with something that doesn't take a great deal of time, doesn't burden us too much, but at the same time accomplishes good briefings for us as we go along.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, especially, in the area of reputation risk management. Thank you.
Should I take that down as committee direction?
Yes.
Okay.
Ms. Mother?
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to say, I note that we are more than halfway through this plan, and I think, 2.5 plus, 2 plus might not seem like a high number when you compare it to 5, but you've noted all the sort of special features of CalPERS and how we are different from the others in the pool of in the CEB benchmark. And what I think is particularly we need to always be mindful of is, of course, we want very strong compliance, but there's a sort of a cost to each marginal investment in compliance, and we can't afford to spend unlimited amounts of money on compliance. We have a budget that we have to be mindful of, and so really assessing what is the marginal value of each additional investment, and is that going to make a meaningful impact that's commensurate with the cost of that investment. And I think this team has been doing a really good job of really trying to identify high value places to invest. And to me, that is one of the keys. Obviously, there's some things you absolutely must do, and we're doing those. But in terms of continual improvement towards higher and higher levels of compliance, that assessment is, I think, is such an important part of our decision making. So I really credit this team with being thoughtful, methodical, and continuing to sort of embed this within the organization. Thank you.
And I would say, thank you for that. I would say that in determining what to do this upcoming year, we looked at items like what are the things that are going to move us forward? What is it going to take to get those things done? Where are we in our environmental cycle as an organization that really is going to help us move these particular things forward? And the thing about the upcoming year, the plan, is that it is very methodical in terms of exactly what we think we need to do in order to reach those next levels. And so what we're excited about is to be able to say we're at a 2+ now, and we expect to be at a 3 or 3+ next year. And here are the things that we think we're going to do in order to move us there.
Yeah. Great. And then I think the sort of really important work that I've seen this group do is around culture and sort of really trying to embed it more into the culture of CalPERS, because that will support any additional education, investment, technology, all of those types of things. Unless you have the culture right, those other things can't work as effectively. So that is, to me, is a really important key.
It is, and the embedded process that we have undertaken is an important one, and one that really sort of, integrates throughout the organization. And we do have our embedded compliance and risk liaisons, and we use them to really help us to be more visible and to provide guidance and to let individuals know that if they have questions, they have folks that they can go to. And we really work very closely with those individuals to make sure that they know that we're here and we know that they're there, and that, we help give them tools. A lot of times we give them a lot of tools to help them stay on top of things, monitor training, and do things like that. So it is very important to us, and that is one of our items that we've been spending a lot of time on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Costigan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple issues. One, the gift issue, and I know that's a small point. I actually have another question. We already have policies for that, right?
We do.
I mean, there's this Form 700. So we're not seeing widespread abuse in that area.
Oh, no. And my comment was really meant to show that our view is that we understand that, having a policy is great and it's out there for folks. But a lot of times what we really want to do is we want to hit people more frequently with reminders about things. And so people understand that there's a policy that's out there, but what we really would like to do is to go, at the point of time, almost like just in time. At the time that something is happening in the environment, we're out with a discussion or a topic or a reminder or some guidance about how to handle this particular issue.
I mean, a couple points, and then I want to get to one. I agree with Ms. Mather. At some point, there's a cost issue to it, and if you're a Form 700 filer, I would expect you to be aware of the rules, not necessarily having you to remind someone quarterly of what the rules are. I mean, that's why we have Form 700s and other rules related to that, because that then concerns me, or at least I'd like more. What does established incentives and disciplinary measures actually mean under the reinforced behavioral expectations? So what are the incentives, first of all? And we already have a process for disciplinary measures. So could you expand on that for me?
Are you speaking from your SPB hat?
I'm just speaking to that there's a process as it relates to disciplinary measures.
So what we were thinking about when we looked at this is, in the private sector, there are disciplinary measures that are involved, particularly on the personal trading side. So, for instance, in the private sector, if you have personal trading violations, you have disgorgement of profit as one of the things that can happen to you. We actually don't have that as a tool in our toolbox, and we don't necessarily know that we need it. But what we have put in is that in our processes, we've included HR now much more than we used to, in terms of when we see issues or when managers have issues with employees. So when we talk about establishing incentives and disciplinary measures, it's thinking about one of the things also that we're looking at is, can we embed compliance? Can that be one of the things that's a considered element as we're doing appraisals for folks, or that as we're doing incentives? So, we have a lot of individuals that have incentives here at CalPERS, and one of the things that we would like to see and that we've been discussing is, can we include compliance measurements as part of a consideration in awarding those incentives?
I want to make sure I understand this. Someone that complies with a requirement, such as filing a Form 700, would be incentivized to do that?
No. So what I'm saying is, we have individuals, say I have an incentive plan, or others have an incentive plan. So one of the things that we're thinking about is, how can we include compliance measures? So in assessing someone for an incentive, one of the elements or questions might be, have there been any compliance issues with this individual? Do we have personal trading issues? Do we have Form 700? Do we have training issues? Are they always up on their training, or are they routinely late? Those sort of considerations are things that we believe could be made in making those determinations around incentives.
So I would caution that if you are denying someone an incentive based on a compliance issue, is that in fact a disciplinary issue?
Right.
I'm just saying that's something to look at, because the way this is written is established incentives and disciplinary, and I would definitely talk with Ms. Campbell and HR and,
Yes.
and others, because what I just heard is we'll look at if there's been a compliance or non-compliance. So the inverse is, if there's a compliance issue that doesn't allow you to get the incentive, was there a corresponding disciplinary action, progressive disciplinary action? Again, you can't have it either. I didn't
Correct.
get it, so where's the document over here that says why I didn't? So I just want to caution, by setting something new out, are you creating the potential for someone to challenge, I didn't get fairness in
Right.
my incentive compensation? You said I had a violation. I never had the opportunity to contest that.
So here's what I would say. All the work that we are doing in coordination and in conjunction with our HR partners. And so we are actively talking about ideas around how we can incorporate those items, compliance elements really, into the appraisal process for individuals. I would agree with you that there needs to be, if you're going to penalize somebody on an incentive basis, there also needs to be sort of evidence of those issues having been brought up and discussed. And I would say that we would not embark on making any significant changes without the approval and the process completion and the thoroughness of a process with our HR partners. And again, we bring this up as an item to show sort of what are the things that are part of a mature program. And so compliance considerations is something that, at least in the maturity program that we're looking at, is something that is to be considered.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Sure.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, I agree. We have to make sure with any of those that we do process.
Absolutely.
Mr. LaFazo for Betty Yee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Diadamo, for an interesting and valuable report. I think some of the other comments have done a really good job of putting in context what's strong performance, what's aspirational, what might be investments required for various types of improvements. But I wonder if you could just paint a bit of a picture as to what things would look like if we were pushing to 4 or 5. I acknowledge fully what the potential investments might be, but just educate us what those aspirational activities might look like.
So I think for us, pushing to a 4 or a 5 really involves the time that we need to spend to mature the things that we're doing. I think that, we did a lot of work in the past year on policies. We did a lot of work on delegations. So we're doing a lot of work right now around governance. We're doing a lot of work in training. So for us, the items that we think we need to do are part of our plan, and it really is a function of us spending the time to develop the program and the individuals and the workflow, really, that we need in order to get there. So for instance, our embedded compliance risk and compliance liaisons is something that we've been spending quite a bit of time on, and that is important to help move us into the direction of a mature program where we have individuals that are in the seat, in the business essentially, that are there, that are helping to improve the culture, that are there to help with tools for measuring, and that are available to individuals to make sure that things are being done, at the time that they need to be done, and that there isn't, I'll say that it's clear. So a lot of the maturity part of a program really is in spending the time to really develop those workflows and processes and the clarity of who has to do what. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you.
I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say.
Okay.
I think an additional enhancement to get us to a 4 or 5 would also be probably a level of increased automation that we don't have and may be very costly, like Ms. Mather had suggested, to understand all the laws and rules that apply to us. And as those laws and rules change, having more automation for us to know how those touch our systems and our operations, so that we can make sure that we're always in compliance as those rules change. And so, because we are a pretty big and complex organization with a variety of systems and operations, it may be beyond our reach to get to a 5, to have all of that very just seamless and automated. There's always going to be a manual kind of interface for the different programs and areas to be able to make that happen.
It is important to note that automation, though, is one of the things that we're looking at. And so where possible, just like throughout the rest of the organization, we are looking to do things more expediently and more expeditiously. And so for us, automation looks like having, databases and things like that. So it's having information that's sort of integrated into workflows and processes so that things are being brought up or noted at a particular point in time as opposed to later. Right. Sure.
Okay, thank you. And seeing no further questions, this is an action item. Do I have a motion? Okay, so it's moved by Slayton, seconded by Mather. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, 6B, the proposed amendments to the personal trading regulation, and this is a first reading.
Yes, we are very pleased to bring this to this committee at this time. The personal trading regulation, which I talked a little bit about in the previous agenda item, is the regulation that is used to govern personal trading transactions of individuals and board members at CalPERS. And so it is a regulation that was enacted in December of 2012 and has not, for the first time, and has not been modified or changed since then. So at 5.5 years into the regulation, we really thought it was a great time to come back and improve upon what we've learned or integrate what we've learned in the past 5.5 years, as well as make sure that we are updating the regulation to be in alignment with industry best practices and SEC guidance. And so what is before you is the updated, or the proposed, I should say, the regulation. For us, I mentioned that, we have a personal trading regulation, and why do we do it? We measure and monitor different aspects of personal trading regulations for individuals and board members. And for us, the reason why we do it is the recommendations, as I mentioned, are align with recent SEC guidance, industry standards, and to increase efficiency and effectiveness of the personal trading oversight. And that last item really is a significant one because, as I mentioned, 5.5 years into this the administration of this regulation, we've learned a lot about personal trading processes, about sort of the systems that we use, and sort of what is the best way to be effective and efficient, again, sort of moving toward the automation of monitoring personal trading. So for us, the proposed changes in this regulation encompass essentially 3 categories, I would say. The covered person, so one of the things that we've done and learned in the last 5.5 years is that we don't need to have as many individuals considered to be covered persons. When we originally promulgated the regulation, we were very broad in terms of who was a covered person. And a covered person, as you all know, is a person that's subject to the regulation. And so what we've done in the last 5.5 years is really looked at the impact of the regulation on the individuals that work here and have really made some determinations about to be really targeted in terms of who this regulation needs to cover. And what we've settled on are mostly folks that are in the investment office. Everyone in the investment office is in fact a covered person. And then folks that touch on investment decision making or have access to information. And so that's one of the major changes in this regulation is to look at and revise the number of covered persons. The second topic or category of changes in this regulation is to include exchange-traded funds. And this is one where we have determined that the inclusion of exchange-traded funds as a covered security, and so a covered security is a security that's subject to the regulation, is important because it really helps with the efficient and effective administration of the program. It's very confusing because there are different types of exchange-traded funds, some of which would otherwise qualify as covered securities and others that wouldn't. And so the thought here is that, one, SEC guidance is that you should include exchange traded funds, so we're not outside of guidance that way. But by including exchange traded funds, we also will provide a lot more clarity to our covered individuals or our covered persons around what they need to pre-clear and what applies to a particular security. So it's really moving towards everything is included as it relates to the ETF space, and therefore they have a lot more clarity around what they would have to pre-clear and what they wouldn't have to pre-clear. And we really estimate that by doing this, we will significantly cut down on the number of false positives or violations that we end up seeing, because people just are not always clear about whether or not something qualifies as an ETF. And so this is a big one for us, and I think it was very important for us to do. The next item is, and really the last one is sort of the clarifications of the regs. Again, as I've mentioned a couple of times, it's been 5.5 years since this regulation has been updated, and so really what we wanted to do is go through and streamline it and make it more clear in spots where now 5.5 years into the administration, we know that there's sort of questions or interpretations that needed to be made. And so that's one of the other categories sort of changes that we've embarked on in improving and adding to this regulation. Let's see. I think that's it for that part of the presentation. I think at this point I'll stop and see if there's any questions.
Well, thank you. We've had the benefit of experience and for you to see in areas where we can improve, and so I really appreciate this report. And yes, we have a question. Ms. Mather?
Thank you. My question is really about the covered persons component of your proposal. And right now, could you just clarify sort of what are the different categories of covered persons that are currently included, and which ones are you proposing would be excluded, and also how many people does that entail? I know you still have a study, maybe you still have the assessment to do, but do you have a sense of how many people that entails?
So I'm going to give you probably approximations, because
Okay.
I think that my numbers might be off by 1 or 2 here or there, and I might look to my team members too to make sure that they keep me honest. I would say that the current number is around 650. So we have around 650 individuals that are deemed to be covered persons within our personal trading regulation. And on page 73 and 74 of your board book, it actually lists sort of those categories of individuals that are either were or proposed to be covered persons. And so what we have done in looking through the past 5.5 years is we've revised the covered person definition to really be more tight around folks that are involved in the investment decision-making process. And so again, as I mentioned, when we implemented this, it was a very broad sort of analysis that was used, and we sort of, I was going to say caught up, and I don't know if that's the right word, but we've included a lot of individuals that, because it was the first time and we wanted to make sure that we were being thorough. And so again, 5.5 years in, we're really looking at the activity that we're seeing and the folks that really need to be reviewed, because the other part of this is that there is a fair amount of work when we talk about resources that go into monitoring the transactions of individuals. And so we do have electronic feeds for a lot of our individuals where the trades are coming in and they're being monitored electronically and they're being flagged electronically, or automatically, I should say. But we also have other instances where we have manual things, and we have a lot of folks that have questions and things like that. So we really wanted to keep the covered person body to those people that we really thought needed to be involved. And it is a fair amount of, it's an effort really to be a covered person. It's not something that people undertake lightly, because there are obligations and requirements that come with it. And so we want to make sure that for those people that we really put into this role, that they really need to be there. And so I want to say that we've sort of gone, or the thought is, and I think the thought is that we'll go from around 650 to 250?
We reduced about 200.
To about 200, 250.
We reduced 200 out of.
Okay, so we took 200 out.
So I guess my follow-up question, and I appreciate that we only want to cover those who should be covered. I think that is absolutely appropriate. I guess the question I have is, this is a different organization than perhaps some financial organizations where we do have an executive team that might be privy from time to time to some confidential investment information. I'm thinking, some of our public affairs people, for example, might know certain things about some pending investment decisions that, in another company that might not be the case. And I just want to make sure, and I'm not trying to target anybody in particular, but I just want to make sure that those who have access to inside information about CalPERS investment decision making, either in general as a regular part of their job, or even, it might be occasional, that we're careful about ensuring that they are reporting appropriately, or that they are covered persons if they should be.
Yes. I mean, we, in making these proposals, we have looked at this information a lot of different ways, and have really, I believe, made sure that the folks that we are covering are those who we think will come into that contact and have that as part of their business. I will also add that, and I was thinking about this early this morning, that there are rules about using non-public material information in trading, and so all of us, whether or not we're a covered person, are subject to those rules. And so we all know, as individuals that may or may not from time to time come into information, that we are not allowed to trade on that. And so we think that in drawing the lines around the folks that we've drawn them around, we've covered that. But I would also note that, there are I'll say, the federal rules, the SEC rules that are out there, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And
Sure.
We've discussed this before when we were at 650, like it was definitely overreaching to the people who had access. So this really makes it a lot more efficient and easier to monitor. Mr. Costigan.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just have a couple concerns as it relates to some of these changes, more towards the ETF. So I need to understand this. The purpose of an exchange-traded fund is to trade broad-based indexes, asset classes, so I can trade a technology ETF where I may not be able to trade Apple on a daily basis, because you'd have to have Apple for a hold for 30 days. What I'm trying to find out is, what's the distinction, other than the fact you can trade an ETF daily, between that and a mutual fund? Because I could trade a mutual fund every 24 hours. I mean, not including the 30-day wash, but I could go into similar funds. So ETF I could trade right now, that's why you use ETFs. Mutual fund only trades once a day at 4 o'clock. So there's no problem with, I just want to make sure, there's no problem with doing mutual funds every 24 hours. Is that right?
There we go. Good morning. Justin Walker, CalPERS team member. The key distinction between ETFs and mutual funds is ETFs trade on the secondary market. The price fluctuates throughout the day. Much like a closed-end mutual fund, which is also a covered security. Mutual funds do not trade on the secondary market. To your point, the price is marked once a day. And the SEC feels that because the price can fluctuate intraday, it has the potential to be subject to the same abuses that a stock would.
What's the site on the SEC, please?
Bear with me. So that is based on an SEC no action letter. It was National Compliance Services, Inc., and the file number for that is 132-3.
And so what I'll add, Mr. Costigan, is that, as Justin had indicated, there is SEC guidance and support for including ETFs as part of our covered securities. And so we've chosen to do that because we find that there are ETFs that, even if they're not a covered security, or if they have the characteristics essentially that make them covered securities. And so for us, the inclusion of the ETFs is really a move towards helping to clarify for our individuals, our covered persons, what they need to do in order to be compliant with our personal trading regulation.
In this letter, the site is from a September 27, 2012 case. If I'm reading it, 132-3, response of the Office of the Chief Counsel, Division of Investment Management, LCH.
It's actually November 2005.
So we're going back to a letter that's 13 years old as the basis for the change in the policy?
Well, I would say that the basis for the change in policy in a large respect is the fact that we have a lot of individuals that are unclear about whether or not ETFs are actually covered, meaning that something that looks like an ETF, maybe even might be categorized as an ETF, ultimately ends up being a covered security. So for us, the inclusion of ETFs is really around helping individuals to be certain about what they need to do in order to be compliant with our regulation. And I will add that the SEC guidance is a little bit more support, not a little bit, it is a lot of support towards indicating that we're not outside of acceptable boundaries in terms of our personal trading regulation.
I'm just looking, I just want to make sure, just write my notes. The letter is 13 years old that we're relying on. And the other is if you're now using Compliance 11, which should now become the basis, if you wanted to trade an ETF, the use of Compliance 11 would actually determine whether it's a covered or non-covered security, rather than the blanket. What I'm trying to get at is there's a system, we now have a system in place, it's got some flaws, but I know you all are working through that. But if you were to punch in the symbol, it'll tell you whether or not it's a covered security or not. The current system would do that?
Under the current regulations, there are some distinctions between ETFs, and that's what causes a lot of the confusion, active versus passive, ETFs versus ETNs. The system cannot recognize that. However, under the proposed regulations, when all ETFs are covered, the system will function in a fully automated manner.
And I guess that's why I was going to rephrase the question. Under the current policy, the distinction is between active and inactive ETFs. And
that's one of the distinctions.
And the Compliance 11 or the Schwab-based system that we use is just not capable of telling us that?
Correct. If someone were to put in a pre-clearance request for an ETF, it would require an individual on the desk to manually review it to determine if it was active or passive.
Right. So for the way that we have it now, each ETF that would be deemed a covered security would individually have to be coded into the system in order to recognize it as a covered security. And it would be a covered security not necessarily because it was an ETF, but because it had a characteristic that made it a covered security. And so with the proposed regulation in making all ETFs covered security, it's going to be a very easy and a very fast way for individuals to know right away and whether or not a security is going to be a covered security.
There was a lot of confusion, and this is where we saw a lot of, through confusion, violations. So we're trying to streamline that.
So this is really an attempt to mitigate the confusion that occurs when folks aren't sure that something either is or is not an ETF or is or is not a covered security. And so you'll have someone who won't pre-clear something because they think that it's not required, and then they'll end up with a violation.
No, I understand it. I appreciate that. I mean, my concern is the fix is blanket rather than looking at fixing the system.
Well, I don't think through the nuance in the automation, unless we blanket it, we can't fix it.
Well, that's.
So.
I just have concern.
No, I understand your concern.
Is the ability not to trade an individual stock and to have a little more ability to work inside of your portfolio. What we're now doing is moving it out to 30 days, and it's a software issue. I understand that.
Yeah, it's a software issue. We can't do the code. We can't get nuanced in our coding.
But Justin did dial me into a new site that actually shows the distinctions. It just requires a little more work to go through it. So anyway, I know this is a first reading. I'll have more questions next time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Slayton.
Maybe a clarification. This isn't a first reading, is it? This is an action item or not?
This is an action item, right?
It's an action item to move the regulation process forward.
Correct.
Okay.
And so what happens is it would then go to the Office of Administrative
Right.
Law. It would go through that process, public comment period, and then it would be promulgated if there aren't any changes.
Okay, as one person who makes many phone calls over the years to Justin Walker to try to clarify whether something is covered security or not, I'm very much in favor of this to kind of simplify and kind of set a standard. I have found in the time I've been on this board that the responsiveness of compliance has been excellent. And while I have to go through a step, that step is pretty easy to do, and the timeliness of the response has been good and has not prevented me from doing whatever I want to do from an investment standpoint. So I think it's a good step to do this, good clarification, and I think it will reduce the number of phone calls that I have to call you to go over the details. So with that, I would move the action item.
Okay,
You're
this-
still welcome to make those phone calls.
That's all right. I probably will anyway, but.
This item has been moved by Slayton, seconded by Mather. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. So now we're on agenda item 7. Mr. Grimes, your report on the 2018-2019 Enterprise Risk Management Plan.
So while he's coming up with me is Forrest Grimes, Chief Risk Officer for CalPERS. He'll be presenting the Risk Management Annual Plan.
Good morning, Madam Chair, committee members, board members. I think it's worthy to note that Mr. Fechner joined during the compliance plan presentation. Thank you for attending. Forrest Grimes, CalPERS team. Today, what we're really doing, if I could get you to turn to page 153 in your board books, please. This is the annual Enterprise Risk Management Work Plan submitted for your review and approval. I think that as you look at this item, you'll really note that what we're doing here is we're transitioning from really what I'm going to call infrastructure development to implementation. With one exception, which is the data governance item. That's really new to the risk team, and we're really still in the planning phase of that very important element. With that, I'm going to pause and see if you have questions on any of the specifics within the plan. Thank you.
I see no questions. Continue.
Okay. Really, we don't have anything further to present other than the plan itself. And we would seek your approval at this time.
Okay. Okay. Motion made by Mather. Second by Costigan. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Thank you very much. And if I might note that we have a few of the risk team members here. We're kind of a small but mighty team, and I would like them at least to wave to you so that you can see what...
Well, I want to thank them on this. This is a tremendous undertaking, and the thoroughness, the methodology, it's very impressive. So thank you.
I know they're going to scurry off and start on it right away now that it's approved, so thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you. A wave. Okay, we're waving back. Okay, thank you. So that brings us to agenda item 8, Ms. Chapui on the 2018-2019 Audit Services Plan.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Belize Chapui, CalPERS team. Agenda item 8.8 is a action item. Office of Audit staff is requesting Risk and Audit Committee to approve Office of Audit Services proposed audit plan for fiscal year 2018-19. The internal auditing standards we follow require the audit plan to be risk-based to determine the priorities of the internal audit activities. In conducting the risk assessment, Office of Audit Services, as a third line of defense, coordinated its efforts with the second line of defense, Enterprise Compliance Division, and Enterprise Risk Management Division. We interviewed CalPERS executive and senior management teams and sought input from the board members through surveys. Office of Audit Services has two audit programs, internal audits and public agency reviews. In identifying the internal audit activities and assignments, staff evaluated multiple risk factors: contribution to the organization's strategic goals, changes in the operations and regulations, impact on the financial statements, existing internal controls, and information from prior internal and external audits. For the public agency reviews, Office of Audit Services plans to complete 4 review cycles during fiscal year 2018-19, covering 1 compliance area per each cycle. Using data analytics, staff will identify approximately 60 to 80 high-risk agencies for review for each cycle. In preparing the internal audit plan, Office of Audit Services also allocated resources to consulting engagements, special projects, and activities related to contracted external audits and reviews. As required by the internal auditing standards, will remain responsive to the changes in the organization's operations and programs, and will review and update the audit plan for fiscal year 2018-19 as necessary. Any modifications to the audit plan will be communicated to the committee through the quarterly status reports. This concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Mather.
Thank you. My question is with respect to public agency reviews. For several years now, we've been using data analytics to help identify sort of the key areas we should be focusing on in public agency reviews. Over time, can you talk about, have you seen a change in the type of issues that are arising? Are you seeing, are the same issues continuing to be prevalent, and what can we, and are you, so I guess what I really want to do is, if we can get to sort of the root of some of these problems and address them in a systemic way, that could reduce your workload.
We would love to see that happen as well.
Yeah.
What we're doing, this will be the 3rd year since we implemented the new approach, and we've been using the BI data, business intelligence data, in identifying these high-risk entities. And we still continue to see issues and problems depending on the compliance area we're reviewing. Some of the issues are prone to staff turnover. Although our program staff provides a lot of resources and training to the public agencies, certain reporting issues still continue to come up. And I guess audits will be a way of continuing to keep an eye on it and going out to the public agencies and basically showing them, we're still keeping an eye on it and we're monitoring it and making sure all these reporting are taking place in accordance to the PEARL.
Yeah, I guess I would challenge us, and it's not the audit services role, but I would challenge us to think about, if there are these perennial issues, to think about what requirements can we place on employers in terms of mandating new, if they have a new payroll person, that they do this training immediately. Maybe we already have these things in place, and it's not sufficient. But
and that's my partner. They do that.
Ms. Ostrander knows the answer to my question.
Good morning, Renee Ostrander, CalPERS team member. We do, directly to your point, we do look at enhancing the training in areas where we do see that there's a lot of difficulty in attaining compliance. And so we target areas where we find that there's high risk and that auditors go out and we find that there's a significant number of findings. We do target what we do for that training. But Belisa's right. You do have turnover and you have these other things that you take 2 steps forward in doing that training, and then you take a step back. And so you need to make sure that you catch those people. And we do try to do that. Also, in some of the work that we've done with our audit resolution process, we've changed that quite a bit over the last year, and we've had quite a bit of success. One of the things that we've placed into there is where we have employers that have continual issues in a particular area, we are looking at requiring training. And so kind of building that additional step in as type of a mitigation process for that particular employer where we've noticed that we're not getting the compliance to become a habit for them.
Right. Okay. Well, that sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, this is an action item. Okay, so moved by Mather, second by Costigan. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Now we're on 8B, the Independent Auditors 2018 Annual Plan.
Police Shupui again. Moving on to item 8B. This item also is an action item. Staff is requesting Risk and Audit Committee to approve independent auditor KPMG's audit plan for CalPERS financial statements for fiscal year ending June 30, 2018. KPMG staff is here presenting with me. I'll turn it over to them to present their audit plan and provide the Risk and Audit Committee an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have.
Great.
The other one.
Mike, great. And do we need the clicker as well for advancing slides? Thank you very much. Good morning, Madam Chair, committee members, board members. Since this is the first time KPMG is appearing before the board, I thought before we got into our presentation, we might just do a brief introduction of the team members that we have here this morning for you. So I'll get going. My name is Brock Romano. I'm an audit partner in what we call our public sector line of business. That's the line of business that focuses exclusively with state and local governments. I've spent the better part of my 30-plus years working within that group. The last few years that, in terms of relevant experience here in California, I've worked with several of the public agencies, either in my role as a lead audit partner, a concurring partner, and or what we call a GASB 68 specialist, to make sure that those public agencies properly reflect their participation in your PERFs, primarily PERF A, in their financial statements. I've also had the pleasure of working with multiple state public employee retirement systems, primarily in the Northeast, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, New York, New Jersey, and also the state of Georgia. Excited to be part of the KPMG CalPERS team, presenting and meeting for you folks for the first time. Looking forward to working with management and so forth. I'll let my colleagues kind of also introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the agenda.
Hi, my name is Lisa Avis. I am a managing director, also in the public sector line of business with KPMG, and have spent the majority of my 20 years in that line of business. I've worked with several state agencies here in California. I'm located just a couple blocks away in our office here in Sacramento. For a couple years of my career, I actually did a fellowship with the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. And to echo Brock again, happy to be here to serve you.
Hi, my name is Bridget Jerfy. I am a senior manager in our Sacramento office, and I just got back from doing a rotation in our national office in New York, and I'm excited to be working with CalPERS management and using some of the skills that I've learned in our national office and applying them to this engagement.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Bridget. Okay, so just moving through the agenda, I will cover the first two agenda items, the client service team and the scope of services. I'll ask Lisa to take us through the objectives all the way through risk assessment. Bridget will spend a moment talking about our audit approach and the focus areas. I think for the folks that have been through this in the past, a lot of this will seem familiar in terms of scale and scope. And then I'll close out the meeting with a discussion about some of our independence quality standards, touch a little bit upon some of the recent accounting pronouncements from GASB, and then quickly wrap up. So with that, I'm flipping into our client service team. It's a fairly robust and complicated team, as you'd imagine. I think the takeaways that I'd like to leave with the committee is that myself, Bridget, and Lisa, along with John Hubba, who's our concurring partner, constitute what I call the core engagement team. So it's our responsibility to coordinate the 40 to 50 professionals, if you will, that are going to assist us in the conduct of this year's audit. Our team does contemplate the use of what we call some subject matter professionals. I think the first step that KPMG goes through when we put together an audit team is to understand kind of the complexities of our client, what specialized skills they might need, and then to tailor the team to reflect those needs. So you'll notice on the right-hand side of our slide, we've got some subject matter professionals that encompass governments, GASBs, public employee retirement systems, specialists in investments, actuarial services, IT, and even investment valuation services. Some of those folks will have what I'll describe as a direct involvement, client-facing, working with members of CalPERS management. Others will be on a consultative basis to assist us in dealing with complex accounting issues as they come up, and as well as our subcontractor, who's part of our plan. So we'll pause for a minute if there's questions on the team, and certainly invite the committee members to make this interactive if they so desire.
I see none, so please continue.
Great. Thank you very much. So just flipping over into our scope of services, again, this ought to sound very familiar to committee members. Thank you, Lisa. I need some help up here. Audit of the comprehensive financial statements, as well as what we call the specified elements special reports for GASB 68 and 75. That scope of services results in multiple deliverables, including the audit of the financial statements. Because the audit of the financial statements is also done in what we call generally accepted government auditing standards, there is a required byproduct of that standard, which is report on internal controls and compliance. We'll also have separate deliverables on GASB 68 and the GASB 75 specified elements. So for 68, there's 3 deliverables for perf A, B, and C, and then for 75 on the OPEB standards. In the fall, we'll meet again with the Risk and Audit Committee to make our presentation of the reports, as well as communicate any of the required matters under professional standards. And then to the extent that there's any comments that we have on process improvements, internal control deficiencies, don't like to use the word, but nonetheless, that's the standard word. If there are such items, we'll write those up and have a report to this committee at that time. Just wanted to touch a little bit on timing. Normally, our timing kind of happens in distinct phases, with planning and field work kind of happening separately. Given where we are in the calendar, that has kind of morphed into one process, all geared towards achieving the milestone, the statutory reporting deadlines at the end of October, and then being able to present to this committee for approval and issuance sometime in November. Plan is to have the GASB 68 and 75 deliverables issued within 2 to 3 weeks after the issuance of the CAFR. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Lisa, who's going to walk us through the next few slides. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brock. So you've all been through an audit, so you're familiar with the objectives of an audit. The purpose is to express an opinion on the financial statements that are prepared by management with your oversight to make sure they are fairly presented. Now, in order to achieve that objective, we plan and perform the audit to provide reasonable, not absolute assurance that those financial statements are fairly presented. In order to achieve that, we design tests to look at the accounting records that are used to prepare those financial statements. We look at estimates, and I'll talk about estimates later. I mean, this is a retirement system. There's quite a few estimates that go into compiling those numbers within the financial statements. As Brock had mentioned, there are several deliverables. One of them is issued in accordance with government auditing standards. And so because of that, there are some controls we have to consider and compliance with laws and regulations that are part of our audit as well. So the next few slides here will talk about responsibilities of management, of the Risk and Audit Committee, and of us, KPMG. So management is responsible for the preparation of those financial statements. Management's also responsible for making any adjustments that they are aware of to make sure those financial statements are fairly presented when the report is issued. Management is also responsible for maintaining internal control over the financial statement preparation. Now, we don't opine on internal control, but we are required to consider it as part of our audit. And so we would be looking at was there the reviews over the financial statements, analytical procedures performed by management over those reports that are issued. Management also will provide us with access to books and records so that we can complete our audit. And then at the end of the audit, there's a representation letter. We call it the management representation letter that management will sign acknowledging their responsibility for these key elements within the audit. The Risk and Audit Committee and management overall are responsible for the tone at the top, just setting proper tone at the top, making sure that the financial statements comply with the appropriate standards and compliance with laws and regulations as it relates to the financial reporting process. As I had stated earlier, we plan to perform the audit in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards and government auditing standards. There is also some other information issued within the CAFR. You know, the CAFR, we have a copy here, pretty thick document. And so our opinion covers the financial statements, but there is other information within the CAFR that we are required to read for consistency within the document as it relates to the financial statements. Okay, so there's quite a few bullets here, and I'm not going to read them all, but we will maintain constant communication throughout the audit. We will be on site working with CalPERS team here. We'll have weekly status meetings, and during that time, we'll be communicating the status of our audit. If we identify any issues, that will be the time that we bring those up as well. No one likes surprises at the end, so we want to maintain constant communication throughout the audit. In 5 short months here, we'll be back in front of the Risk and Audit Committee to present the results of those audits, and so there's a variety of things that we're required to communicate. As Brock had said, our opinion over the financial statements and any findings or other matters that are required to be communicated will be presented at that time. Okay, so moving on to materiality within our audit. So no longer is materiality just a mathematical calculation. In addition to the quantitative factors that we consider in calculating materiality, there's a lot of qualitative aspects that we consider as well. So our determination of materiality, it's a matter of professional judgment, and it considers the financial information needs of the users of those financial statements. So there are several deliverables that we had mentioned. When we calculate our materiality, there are key elements. There's opinion units within those deliverables. There's key elements. So our materiality is calculated at a level to make sure that we can touch on those key elements. So it's not a one-size-fits-all materiality when it comes to our audits here. Okay, so we are, a couple weeks into the audit here, and we're in the risk assessment phase of the audit. And so based on our initial assessment coming in, there's a few risks here that we identify as significant risks, and these areas are susceptible to misstatement either by the nature of the accounting or rebuttable procedures from the AICPA. So the first one is the risk of management override of controls. Now, this is the risk will vary from entity to entity, but it is present just based on the nature of management's role and the access to books and records.
I'm going to interrupt you.
Yes, of course.
We're on a timed agenda now.
Okay.
So I want to kind of stick with that. So at this point, I'm going to ask my fellow board members if there are any questions, and I see a few. And so because obviously this is not our first audit.
Right.
So let's take questions from the board. Mr. Slayton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to go back to page 7 of 19, and I've been involved from a governance standpoint in lots of audits for different organizations, and I run into this same language all the time, so I'd like you to expand on it a little bit. And that's in the KPMG responsibilities, and I see this in a lot of audits. It's not just this one. So the audit of financial statement includes consideration of internal controls over financial reporting, but then it goes on to say, but not for the purpose of expressing an opinion on the effectiveness of the internal controls. So that always is kind of a sticking point with me, that you're taking into consideration the internal controls, but you're not opining on their effectiveness. So can you expand on why that carve out on the internal controls?
Great. Thank you. Well, one is a requirement and one's not a requirement. So for public companies, there is a requirement, a mandate with Sarbanes-Oxley to actually opine on internal controls. Mm-hmm. And in a non-Sarbanes-Oxley environment, there isn't a requirement. So it becomes a matter of judgment and both in terms of time, cost, and effectiveness as to whether planning an audit to rely on controls and opine on controls is conducted. So our approach will be to gain an understanding of controls. We will test some elements of controls for purposes of operating effectiveness. But the objective of the audit in a non-public environment does not include the expression of an opinion. Some of my public sector clients at the beginning of Sarbanes-Oxley, when it was released, debated and thought about whether they would voluntarily go through this exercise. I don't recall if anyone actually did. None of my clients certainly has. If that was something that CalPERS, wanted or desired, there is a possibility that it could be incorporated into the scope of services. There'd be a time and a cost element to it.
Right. Well, I understand this is an annual audit that we have, yep. and I understand the cost implications of opining on internal controls. But it seems to me that every some number of years, it might be of value to do that, to get another pair of eyes looking at our internal controls deeper than you do in the normal audit process.
Yep.
Would you concur that possibly that might be of value on a periodic basis?
I think more information on your internal controls and its operating effectiveness is always better than less. Our audit will provide testing of internal controls, short of an opinion, and we will communicate those results both to management and if there's deficiencies in our deliverables to the Risk and Audit Committee. I think the one observation I would have, if CalPERS were to voluntarily try to submit themselves to an opinion on internal controls, I think it would be an all-in or an all-out. To do it every third year or fifth year, I wonder whether you'd have the momentum and the scale to continue that. But certainly it's worth contemplating and thinking about.
Well, I'd ask the chair to consider asking staff to look at that and to see, if there's value in doing that. Maybe you have an opinion already.
I'm waiting for Ms. Hollinger.
Yes.
Yes, we can do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Any other questions?
No, I'm seeing if he's addressing the same issue.
Make sure you introduce yourself.
Taylor Urban, CalPERS team member. I know we have discussed this the past few years with MGO, and I think the decision was mostly that it was cost prohibitive. The cost of the audit would go up so much for what was really gained, that I think that's where we came down.
Well, I'd like the committee to see it and to at least see what the decision process is and what the cost might be to do that, and then we can weigh it to see if we want to consider it.
So if you can just provide us with that, that would be terrific.
So to be clear, we will do a review to determine whether or not we need to or what it would take, I
Well,
guess, is
yeah,
the
the
question. What it would
cost-benefit.
take, the cost-benefit analysis
Right.
of doing a review along the lines of what Mr. Slayton has indicated.
A clarification question. Are we speaking for future assignments, not this current one, correct?
Yes.
Are we going to?
Well, if it creates a time problem on this one, then I certainly understand that and would defer to staff on that. But I think that going on a go-forward basis, I think we should examine that more closely to see if we believe it's of value at the end of the day to get an outside opinion regarding the effectiveness of internal controls.
We can do that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Costigan.
I'll try to be very quick. Appreciate you all being here. So just very quickly, what California state agencies have you done work with?
Sure. So I was the lead audit engagement partner for the City of Long Beach for a few years, and in my role as concurrent partner, City and County of San Francisco, GASB 68 specialist, City and County of San Francisco and LA Water District, a concurring partner, and probably a few others who.
But any state agencies?
I'm sorry?
Any state agencies?
I was the concurring review partner when we were the auditors for the state for the single audit work that we were doing there several years ago.
Sorry for that.
So we were the auditors of the state of California federal programs, and I was the concurring partner during that time period, the KPMG.
And who was that through?
The state auditor's office.
Okay, so you were hired by the state auditor?
Yes.
Okay. So just a couple quick questions on this, because I'm trying to understand the reporting. And I'm a little concerned about slide 10.
Right.
Are you receiving direction? Who is your direct report? Who do you directly report to?
Who do we
Who
individually?
does this contract directly report to?
We've been working with general counsel and finance folks. I don't think we've been here long enough to have all the nomenclature down, but those are the folks that we've been working directly with.
And I know we're very short on time, and Madam President or Madam Chair, I certainly hope we have a further discussion more than probably be 4 or 5 months, because on page 10 you seem to have. Is this an actual finding, or is it a view of the world?
So you're talking about risk assessments?
Yes, because you have 3 bullet points here.
Sure. Sure. So the auditing standards, and the auditing profession uses terminology that's somewhat meaningful to us. It has sometimes different meanings to the non-practitioners. So risk assessment to us is just what areas pose potential risk to financial statement presentation. So the contents of your CAFR. Are there activities in terms of processing transactions, internal controls, assumptions, things that involve management estimates, things that involve judgment that could be subject to bias, could be subject to manipulation, could be subject to override. And the professional standards require us to understand those risks so we can design appropriate audit procedures to address those risks. It doesn't mean that they're occurring. It doesn't mean that there is inherent.
So I'm sorry, because I know we're short on time. I just want to clarify. The language used in here is just industry language. This is not a finding, because as someone that looks at words, management is in a unique position. That's just that's industry language.
Industry language.
Okay. I just, again, words have meaning. Very important that be caveated somewhere, because if someone's looking at this slide, the way it actually reads is you've identified 3 significant risks, particularly because you talk about one of our portfolios. You don't have a discussion. You talk about a high degree of judgment, which is actually what we pay staff around here for. So there's a subjective versus an objective standard, particularly in investments. And so I just want to make sure, Madam Chair,
No, I agree
that
with
there's
you.
additional information somewhere, because the way this is written creates uncomfort for me as a board member. So thank you.
And also, we're a public agency, so to put something out there that you haven't made a determination would not be appropriate.
Understood. Thank you.
Ms. Hollinger, may I address Mr. Holland, Mr.
We're not married.
I'll keep my mouth shut. Address the question that Mr. Costigan asked with respect to who KPMG, the independent auditor, reports to. Ultimately, KPMG reports to the Risk and Audit Committee. They're going to work with the financial office very closely on a day-to-day basis to look at the papers and understand how we work and all of that. But they report to the Risk and Audit Committee.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, seeing no further questions, this is an action item. Okay, moved by Mather, second by Costigan. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. We're on to number 9, information agenda items, enterprise risk management framework review. Mr. Grimes.
So we have Mr. Grimes coming up again for this one.
You're doing a terrible job.
Oh my God, their presentation was way too long.
Hello again, Madam Chair.
Hello.
Hello. Forrest Grimes, CalPERS team. I'm joined by Melissa Azevedo, who is our Assistant Chief Risk Officer here at CalPERS. I'd like for you to turn to Board Books page 138, please. This is a diagram that you have seen in many presentations, and it's been slightly refined this time. But I would like to, as a reminder, and for the newer board members, to just kind of take a look at the journey that we've been on. We refined the risk dashboard profiles and heat map back in November 2016. In January 2017, we actually had a risk appetite workshop that many of you participated in. In June of 17, we presented the risk appetite statements to this committee. If you go down to November of 17, this is a very important element because we've aligned the enterprise risk to the strategic goals of the organization. I think that's a very important step. This has been done in collaboration with the strategic planning team, and I know that Sabrina Hutchins and her team are going to be presenting some performance updates to you next month at the offsite, and this will further solidify the alignment of the enterprise risks and the enterprise goals. And so I think that's really what we're after here today. Today we're really going to present the strategic risk measures to you, which is the equivalent of the performance measures, however, on the risk side. This really is an exciting thing for the risk team because what it really does is it concludes what I'm referring to as that infrastructure phase, and it actually transitions to implementation phase so that we can use those tools to better manage the risk to the organization. Now, if there's any confusion, and if we can turn to the next slide, please. The confusion is usually the difference between a performance and a risk measure and how to really interpret those. Performance measures really are looking at how well you're doing in achieving the goals that you've set out to accomplish. They're typically lagging indicators showing you how, giving you vision into past performance. Risk measures, however, are typically leading indicators. And so they're really looking at things that could get in the way of you achieving your goals and objectives. It's theoretically possible to have a performance measure that's green and a risk measure that's yellow or red that is telling you, hey, you should look at this before it turns your performance measure yellow or red. And so that's the objective. There's really kind of a couple of, we have a kind of a cute example in here actually that's not related to CalPERS, but I'm going to skip it unless you have questions on that and really get into the risk measures that we're proposing for CalPERS. And Melissa is going to take us through that.
Okay. I see no questions. Continue,
Okay.
Melissa.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you. Good morning, Melissa Azevedo, CalPERS team member. I'll be providing a high-level overview of today's presentation, so I'll refer you to attachments 2 and 3 found on board books pages 147 and 153 for greater detail. If you have any questions, please feel free to stop me along the way or following the presentation. To develop the strategic risk measures, we aligned each of the 8 enterprise risks to one of the CalPERS 5 strategic goals. We then worked with the program areas to identify and quantify drivers of risk in the context of the aligned enterprise risks. We asked what would prevent us from meeting the strategic goal? What are the leading indicators we should monitor to prevent potential risks from occurring? As we go through each goal area, we would also like for you to ask, are we measuring the right things? Will these measures help us monitor and prevent risk? Are there additional measures that we are missing? The strategic goal, fund sustainability, is currently aligned to the enterprise risk, pension funding, and stakeholder confidence. The stakeholder confidence risk mainly addresses the role of CalPERS as a fiduciary in the context of fund sustainability. We identified and quantified those risk drivers that would impact our ability to strengthen the sustainability of the fund. As you can see on slide 5, we felt that the probability metrics currently identified in the strategic plan are better suited as strategic risk measures in monitoring impacts to funding levels. At this point, I'll pause. Madam Chair, would you like for me to continue to go through the rest of the slides, or I'll defer to the committee for questions?
I think in the interest of time and wanting to follow the agenda, let me defer my fellow board members. Are there any questions? I don't see any. You guys have done an amazing job, and I appreciate the thoroughness of the presentation.
I'll just add that we'll be returning in September with our recommended thresholds for you to review.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we're item 10, summary of committee direction.
Yes, thank you. So I have taken down 2 items, both of which were recommended by Mr. Slayton. The first was to work with the chair of the committee to review and perhaps perform additional training with board members along the compliance issues that we were talking about, or elements, I'll say, of the compliance plan that we were talking about earlier today.
Yeah, I had on risk management, including reputation risk management. So, okay.
And then the second item that I've taken down is cost-benefit analysis of the value of performing a review of the effectiveness of our internal controls,
right?
Which I think is a long way of saying what we were talking about around review of internal controls.
Right. And just a third observation, I think in going forward, in adhering to our timed agendas, it's very important we let our presenters know so there's an alignment between the time we've allotted for them and their presentation.
Yes, and I'll say I probably was guilty of that today, so I apologize.
Okay. Okay. I have no one asked to speak. Is there anyone in the audience who wanted to speak? Okay, this concludes the Risk and Audit Committee meeting, and we will be going into closed session, which will not, as soon as the auditorium clears. Ms. Mather, when will the board, because closed session will not take very long. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So I expect if closed session goes for 15 minutes, let's say 10:30 is when we'll start the board meeting.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good job. Good time management.
Oh, me? What?
Turn your mic off.